In this video, we'll be discussing schizophrenia, and on the Canvas page, I will link an example of schizophrenia from the movies. Schizophrenia is a disorder that's characterized by deteriorating ability to function in everyday life, and this must occur for at least 6 months. So let's go ahead and discuss some of the symptoms. So you must have at least 2 of the following to be diagnosed. Hallucinations, maybe hearing voices or seeing something that's not there. Delusions, which would be an unjustifiable belief. Disorganized speech. Grossly disorganized behavior. Weak or absent signs of emotion, speech, and socialization. Now, one of the 2 symptoms must be from the first 3. So hallucination, delusions, and disorganized speech. And as we've discussed before, with a psychological disorder, there must be some social or occupational disturbance. In other words, an inability to function in everyday life. So we're going to break schizophrenia into the positive and negative symptoms. And positive doesn't mean that they're good things. It means that there are things that are there that shouldn't be there. So hallucinations. These are imagined voices or images inside or outside an individual's head. They can be auditory and they can be visual. And I will link some examples of auditory and visual hallucinations on the Canvas page. Delusions occur when someone believes ideas that are clearly false, like people are reading their thoughts or that they control other people's minds. These beliefs are frequently unusual and or impossible. Disorganized speech is any interruption that makes communication difficult, sometimes impossible to even understand. The individual might jump from topic to topic or not complete a sentence or respond to a question with something that's just completely off topic. Disorganized behavior would include maybe talking to yourself, laughing at nothing at all, behavior or movements that are inappropriate or have no clear purpose, or an individual could be catatonic where they don't move at all. So we have a family friend that was diagnosed with schizophrenia at an unusual age. Typically, schizophrenia is diagnosed in your late teens and your early 20s. She ended up with a diagnosis at the age of 50, and she did not have symptoms before that. She was probably a little bit, maybe like early 50s. I have read that perhaps that occurred because of menopause, and that there are some people who end up going through schizophrenia during menopause, but then after they're finally done with all those hormonal changes, the schizophrenia symptoms disappear. So she started off with hallucinations. So she was talking with my sister-in-law, and she shared with her that she saw these people that were building a wall in her neighborhood every day, and that they would then tear it down at the end of the day. My sister-in-law thought, that's a little funny. Then it went to, so that's a hallucination. Then it went to this delusion that these people who were building the wall were living in her house. And then it progressed to telling her that she knew that her husband was cooking drugs, whatever that means, in their kitchen. So he'd be cooking dinner, and alongside the dinner, he was cooking drugs. And then it progressed to, this is, kind of her delusion and her hallucinations. It progressed to now her husband had gotten her 18-year-old daughter into selling the drugs for her boyfriend. And she knew that because she saw them do these signs when they were on a cable car in San Francisco to these other people that they were going to sell the drugs to. And then when it kind of like, they started to realize that things were wrong. And then one night they found her, or one weekend, they found her with a backpack on, and she paced around all night long with this backpack on, kind of muttering things that they couldn't really understand. When they asked her what was going on, she didn't really give them an answer. She just said, I have to do this. They're telling me to do this. And she definitely had, the hallucinations, the delusions, disorganized speech. Negative symptoms are deficits in normal behavior. They take away from the person's ability to interact in everyday life. In other words, they're behaviors that are absent should be present. And sometimes these symptoms can be confused with depression. These symptoms include weak or absent emotions, speech, and socialization. So emotional flatness or flat affect, an inability to start or follow through with activities, a lack of content in speech, and an inability to experience pleasure. They're usually stable over time, but very difficult to treat. So your typical antipsychotics work fairly well on the positive symptoms, but not necessarily on the negative symptoms. So we also saw this in our family friends. So we spent a lot of New Year's Eves together, and she was always kind of a very social, animated type of person, very friendly, very, always willing to kind of help in and jump in the kitchen and do something. And the last New Year's Eve that we saw her, she just kind of sat there and kept to herself. She only spoke if spoken to, and then she only gave really like 1 or 2 word answers. She did not show any emotion on her face, where she'd always been kind of a happy, smiley type of person. And it was just very interesting to see. And unfortunately, she ended up taking her own life, which is never the right answer. But that's what she ended up doing. Cognitive symptoms are not needed for diagnosis, but they're really central to the disease itself. These are limitations of thought and reasoning that are very common in people with schizophrenia. One of the most common of these is difficulty using and understanding abstract concepts, but attention, working memory, and organizing your thoughts can also be a problem. They appear to result from abnormal function in the prefrontal cortex. Cognitive symptoms are subtle. Like negative symptoms, the cognitive symptoms may be difficult to recognize as part of the disorder. Often they are detected only when tests are performed. Cognitive symptoms include poor executive functioning, which is the ability to understand information and use it to make decisions, trouble focusing and paying attention, problems with working memory. And the cognitive symptoms are really one of the things that makes it hard to lead a normal life and earn a living. They can really cause a great emotional distress to the individual. Schizophrenia affects 1% of the general population. It has a heritable component with 6 times greater risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia if you have a parent with schizophrenia. And you can see here in this graph, you can see how, here we see 1% of the general population. And then we get down here to monozygotic twins, and it's a 48% concordance rate. So if you have one identical twin with schizophrenia, there's a 48% chance that the other twin is going to have it. So it appears that more than a dozen genes are common in people with schizophrenia, and the Schizophrenia Working Group is one of the most extensive genetic studies that has been done, and they found 108 genetic loci that are associated with schizophrenia. And these appear to be related to body functions like calcium channel regulation, immunity, dopamine synthesis, and glutamate neuroreceptors. So the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia suggests that there is excess dopamine activity at synapses, particularly in the basal ganglia. The research indicates that there is an increased turnover of dopamine, specifically at D2 receptors, and people with schizophrenia appear to have 2 times as many dopamine receptors, or D2 receptors in particular. In addition, drugs that increase or prolong dopamine activity at synapses can actually mimic schizophrenia. These drugs include things like LSD, amphetamines, methamphetamine, and cocaine. In addition, a lot of antipsychotics actually work by blocking dopamine activity. So high levels of dopamine in the limbic system are going to cause those hallucinations and delusions, but low levels of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex can actually cause some of those negative symptoms. The negative symptoms also may be caused by glutamate. There is also a glutamate hypothesis of schizophrenia. There are also some anatomical changes that are seen in individuals with schizophrenia. The question is, does the brain anatomy changes, do they precede or follow the diagnosis? We know that schizophrenics have enlarged ventricles, suggesting that there's cell death in some brain region. Along those lines, there's reduced gray matter in the frontal lobes, which means that there's less neurons in those frontal lobes, and that would explain the enlarged ventricles. Many schizophrenics show less frontal lobe activity when performing cognitive tasks, as well as abnormal prefrontal cortex activity. So one of the reasons we think that schizophrenia isn't diagnosed until late teens or early 20s is because that's when that prefrontal cortex is finally finished being developed. And so whether it's abnormalities specifically in the prefrontal cortex or the connections of the prefrontal cortex with other brain regions, that remains to be seen. But that perhaps because those areas aren't fully developed until that time, that's why we don't see an onset of symptoms until then. There's also a neonatal theory of schizophrenia that suggests that prenatal influences could be the cause. So there's something that happens early on in prenatal or neonatal development that doesn't really show until, again, late teens or early 20s. So there's also a neonatal theory of schizophrenia that suggests that prenatal influences could be the cause. So evidence for this is that individuals have an increased risk of developing schizophrenia if there were complications during birth, if the mother was exposed to viruses during pregnancy. Your book mentions the first trimester, but I've read about increased risk in other trimesters, and it's not just limited to influenza virus. Other viruses as well could be potentially a risk factors, but it's basically the virus would be some sort of stressor. So it could be a physical stressor that increases risk, but then also emotional stress has been shown to increase risk for developing schizophrenia.